with Darcy again. So we loaded everything we were likely to need and a few things we weren't onto the Land Rover and took off for the Cleland River. A 2-day trip. It was good to be with Darcy and Pershkovitz again. On the way, Darcy told us about a trip he'd made to Sydney a couple of months before in half a dozen perfunctory statements. Then he told us how he'd got caught by a flood in the Warion River last wet. He was coming down with the river with about 2 feet of fresh floodwater in it, and his loaded dinghy had been swept against a big log that had fallen right across the river. He'd had to unload all his gear and skins and pile everything on the log. Then he sank the dinghy, floated it under the log, bailed it out, and loaded up again on the other side. The tree roots were going to break loose from the bank any moment, and he just got clear in time. I was fortunate, he said calmly. The tree followed me 2 miles downriver, and I had to paddle hard to get far enough ahead to have time to drag my boat clear of the water so it could go past. What's the story about this man-eating crocodile in the Cleland, Darcy? We shall not know that until we get there, he replied. These stories alter with every mile they travel. They say it is the same crocodile that took a black fellow from his canoe in the Warion 50 miles away last year, and attacked the camp of a crocodile shooter in the mouth of the Cleland some months ago, and took his dog. A crocodile often gets blamed for every attack in the Gulf if he is big enough and causes enough trouble. Do you think we'll get him, Darcy? If we are lucky and he is still there, he may be gone from there when we reach the Cleland. He wasn't. The place was in a panic. Only the day before, the croc had overturned a canoe and attacked a lubra who was in it. She escaped to the river bank with only bruises on her arm and hands from beating at the croc's head. It was something of a miracle, but there was no rejoicing. The blacks' camp was a big one, half of it on each side of the river, for some reason, and they paddled back and forth in big, heavy dugout canoes. It seemed that the croc, anything from 15 to 30 feet long, according to who you were listening to, had appeared in the river there about 2 months before. The first hint of its presence were the screams of a lubra who saw it going down the bank in broad daylight one afternoon with a frying pan in its mouth. Next day it took a swimming dog 100 yards up the river from the camp, and a few days later a freshly killed calf floated up and down on the tides past the camp. The blacks depended on the river for most of their food, and the situation was becoming desperate. Their expeditions to the mouth of the river, fishing and hunting the big sea cow, or dugong, were suspended when a young boy was dragged screaming into the river, where he'd been paddling along in the shallows, spearing mud crabs. There were about 40 or 50 dogs starving noisily around the camp, but the croc wasn't. Every few days, another of them disappeared into the river. A passing croc shooter called Richards had been persuaded to have a try at getting the croc, but while he was out hunting for signs of him, another dog vanished in a howling welter of foam in the river, right outside the camp. Eventually this bloke, Richards, had a shot at the croc at long range in the spotlight. After that, the attacks had ceased, and it was thought the croc had either been killed or wounded, or at least frightened away. But now he was back in business again. Do you think it's the same croc, Darcy? In this place, it is, most likely. We set up a camp some distance from the blacks' camp, and dogs, and sorted out our gear. Darcy, whose reputation as the best croc shooter in the Gulf was known far and wide, was looked to for relief from the man-eater that had come to beset the Cleland River. Blacks. And there was a new eagerness in his manner. an authority that only seemed to flourish in the atmosphere of swamps and dark, smelly places. An atmosphere of guiltless slaughter and revenge and overhanging silences on bends of rivers. When he wasn't talking or shooting crocodiles, Darcy was almost nondescript, but when there was Croc in the air, he was as colorful as a new scarf. He sorted out 3 of the most intelligible blacks and asked questions that seemed obscure until later, and said he'd see what he could do tomorrow about this cheeky crocodile. In the morning, Darcy took our pick of the 15 or 16 canoes lined up at the bank for us. He chose one of the smallest. We checked the Croc gear carefully, and Darcy put a few drops of oil on his 303 bolt from the dipstick of the Land Rover. Will he be a big old rogue, Darcy, hundreds of years old? As long as he is a big bloke, it does not mean that he is very old. Age and size do not have to go together. A young man can be big, and an old man can be small. You get a big pig and a small pig the same age. You can get a big dog and a small dog from the same litter of pups. Horses are big and horses are small. Why should it be any different about crocodiles? I think this might be an old man crocodile because he let the little girl escape from him, but we shall not know until we have him dead. This man, Richards, has disturbed him. He will not be easy to get. We went downstream first for a look around, Darcy in the front of the canoe and me with my new paddle at the stern. I practiced paddling and steered the canoe very quietly. I'd never used a canoe before. Once we got it moving through the water, its own weight carried it along with very little effort on the paddles, but it was also hard to stop and steer. Still, we only needed one chance, but we'd be lucky to get that. We went about 2 miles down the river, crossing over and back to peek among reeds and backwaters and examine mudbanks and beaches. On the way back to the camp, Darcy surprised me by saying, "There are 2 small crocs living where we have looked, but it's weeks since our big bloke has lived down here." I had seen nothing. After lunch we went upstream. At the second bend I saw Darcy stiffen on the paddle, but our momentum was too great for us to stop in time. We drifted into full view of a big black croc, curved in a great 2-ton heap on a beach 300 yards ahead. It gave me shivers. I began to back paddle, but Darcy said quietly, "We are too late. He will be watching us. Turn the canoe and so that I'm out of his line of sight. Make sure he can see you all the time and can't see me leave. If he cannot see us at all, he will go straight into the water. Keep his attention, and I shall try to sneak up to him." As soon as he was out of sight of the croc, Darcy slipped over the side of the canoe with the 303 and swam ashore. He gently shook the water out of that long-suffering rifle and drifted into the trees on the bank. I maneuvered the canoe around on the bend, just in the view of the motionless croc, and long enough for Darcy to have sneaked up on him 20 times over. Then I saw him, head and shoulders, moving almost imperceptibly towards where the croc lay at the foot of the bank. He had been in my view for 30 yards. I'd been watching for him and hadn't seen him. He was still 15 yards from where he would be able to look down at the croc, or the croc up at him. There wasn't a breath of wind, and I'll swear not a whisper of sound or vibration of Darcy's ghostly approach. But the croc lunged indifferently into the water and sank from sight so completely that it was hard to believe he'd ever been there on the empty beach. Darcy took several minutes to cover the remaining distance and look down to where the croc had been, with the rifle half raised in his hands. Then he opened the bolt and jumped down the bank to examine the marks, while I paddled the canoe along to pick him up. He didn't seem to be as disappointed as I'd expected when I got there. 16 or 17 feet, he said, pointing with his foot to some invisible marks on the hard, parched sand. He is very big and probably very old. We shall not get him that easily. But how did he know you were sneaking up on him? You were nearly there. Did you accidentally make a noise or something? No, said Darcy, I made no noise, but that crocodile has rested on river banks like this one since before croc shooters and cattle came to this country, with nothing to do but listen. It could be that the absence of sounds warned him. Insects in the grass or the ground may have grown quiet or raised tiny alarms ahead of me. We have no way of knowing that he didn't simply get tired of watching you in the canoe or become disturbed, or just felt like a swim or went off to search for another dog. Then we can never get him, I said, depressed at the thought of the croc detecting Darcy's less than audible sneaking. Don't be so melancholy, Darcy laughed. While he is watching for us to sneak up to him on the bank, we shall be approaching from another direction. There are many ways to kill a croc. The more he defeats us, the bolder he will be. He has tasted the easy food of the dogs here, and now he watches the river for more. If he was going to leave here, he would have gone when the man Richards fired a bullet at him. He is hungry now. His need for food will make him careless and give us other chances to try and kill him. That night we tried the spotlight and lit his eyes up from the same corner we'd seen him from the day. He was out in the stream 20 yards off the beach when Darcy stalked him. He watched till we were within 100 yards, then turned round once, went down, and stayed there for 2 hours. We watched. My favorite hope was gone. Darcy admitted that we were unlikely to get him with the spotlight, but he was still optimistic. We have only tried the 2 usual ways, he said. Our croc has survived many such attempts. It is another kind of trap he will fall into, his own stomach. That night, Darcy hung a kerosene lamp on a branch at the bend of the river where he'd seen him both times, just to confuse him and make him uneasy there. I do not want him in that part of the river. Next morning we sent 2 parties of blacks out hunting, one to a flying fox colony up the river and one after wallabies. Try to bring me a dead dingo, he said. You can carry him in your hands because he is a dog and dogs are supposed to smell of human. But carry the flying foxes and wallabies on a spear. He told the blacks to keep their dogs out of the river, but tie a few round the banks to remind the croc of his hunger. Brushkovitz didn't need telling or tying up. I went out and fluked a meandering dingo with a shot at 300 yards. The hunting parties returned with 4 flying foxes and another dingo, but no wallabies. Darcy was pleased. That is good. I was afraid we might have to sacrifice one of the dogs. It doesn't matter now about the wallabies. I hated handling the dead dingoes. Darcy had got a little quicklime and a little strychnine from a bloke at Yellowginda. We put both poisons in one of the dingo carcasses and threw it out of the canoe in a hard-to-find place in a shallow backwater. Make it difficult for him. If I found a meal of barramundi and hen's eggs in the middle of my table, I would be suspicious. I do not like to poison a crocodile. It is not my way of killing him, but if a crocodile could do it, he would take lives that way. I have set a snare and 2 hooks further down. We will go and bait them with the dingo and the flying foxes. The snare was a simple affair, thin wire rope he'd got from the winch on the front of the Land Rover, but so cleverly spliced and snugly set among the mangrove roots that he had to point it out to me from 4 feet away. He waded through the mud with the bait and weaved it into a tangle of mangrove roots. beyond the snare. If he starts pulling at that, he will be well through the snare, and his movement will dislodge it to fall round himself. A trip weight on a snare is hard to conceal and causes you to leave too much evidence of yourself there. Simplicity can succeed where complication outwits itself. Now we'll go and bait the hooks I have set. The hooks were ordinary shark hooks, one the gaff off the harpoon pole, and the other a spare we carried in the crock box, with 6 or 8 foot lengths of the wire cable securing them to trees at the high water mark. They were half a mile apart on the same side of the river. The first was above the water in the tree and the other laid out across the mud with the cable buried. Darcy covered his hands in mud and threaded a flying fox on to each of the hooks. The other 2 foxes we threw out in the river as teasers on our way back to the camp. Next morning I couldn't get Darcy into the canoe quickly enough. In my haste to find out if we'd caught the croc, I almost forgot to put the rifle in. The poisoned dingo was undisturbed, so was the snare, so was the first baited hook, and the second. We even found one of the flying foxes we'd left floating in the river, still floating in the river. But for Darcy's cheerfulness, I would have been very cheerless at what I saw as a complete failure. The croc could even be miles away by this time. It is fortunate that none of our traps were sprung. By small crocs, he observed, it often happens. The day passed dull and hot. Darcy told the blacks to let all their dogs go, and they accepted this as an admission of failure. He didn't seem to mind. Next morning it was lying motionless in the mud at the foot of the tree. The hook was caught, but only just in the side of his mouth, near the hinge by the look of it. The wire strand was as thin as a hair ribbon. Surely he could tear the tree out by the roots with one flick of his enormous neck. Snap, that wisp of wire straightened the hook. Darcy steered the canoe straight down the river without a sign that he'd even seen the croc. We drew level. I wasn't putting very much weight into the paddle, just as it looked as though we were going right on past. Darcy picked up his rusty .303 and shot it fair behind the ear. The massive tail flicked once, almost casually, sloshing mud all over us and the branches around. That was all, except for the axe, to make really certain. We got out and stood there in the mud beside him, just looking. 18 feet of him, a couple of tons at least, broken-toothed and old, 100 years old, evading the blackfellow's harpoon and the lights and rifles of croc shooters for the best part of a century, ranging thousands of miles of coast and river, maybe even a trip to New Guinea now and again. By luck and cunning, he'd survived for that great lifetime to end up on a hook and line, caught like a sprat, or perhaps it was old age that had caught him. He might have been ready to die anyway. Why didn't he pull the hook straight or break the wire, Darcy? Once he feels himself caught, he gives up, replied Darcy. This bloke probably could have broken free. That is why we had to let him think we were going past, so we could get close enough to be sure of putting a bullet in the right place. We stood looking some more, and then Darcy said he knew he shouldn't have touched it. For a croc that size, a flying fox would be less than 1 peanut to a starving man. His stomach was empty, and his brain was old and tired from listening and watching. We are lucky he didn't get food from somewhere else. We would have had to use other methods then. Other methods. Yes, there's a trick with a net using the rise and fall of the tides I'll show you one day. He never did. And a gate trap I learned to make on the lemon. There are ways. Some of them sound so unlogical that they are seldom used, but they can catch crocodiles. The shot had been heard up at the camp, and canoes came belting down the river, crowded with babbling blacks. Word was shouted back up the river from canoe to canoe, and more excited blacks came racing down to see. men, women, and children. We could have got a shot at him from the bank with the spotlight if we'd waited at the right place, continued Darcy. But if we had killed him, we could never have recovered him from the deep current there. And I wanted his hide. This way it is much better. Fifth arrived among the crowding, colliding canoes of deafening blacks and a rickety old canoe with a big split down the side. Children plunged in the water and stirred up the mud in squealing delight. It was safe to swim in the river again, for the time being. Darcy was regarded with all the wonder and respect of a messiah. We stood a little proudly by the dead croc, rolling smokes. I heard Fifth say, "Bloody Joker," and "Lizard Skinners" among the noise. I pretended not to hear, and stood critically watching four black fellows who'd worked for a croc shooter the season before, begin skinning the croc. It took about 15 of them to roll the carcass over in the mud. There would be feasting at the camp tonight, and word of this would soon be spreading from one end of the Gulf to the other. Fifth, Darcy, and I paddled back to the camp in the biggest canoe to sit in the shade making casual remarks about big blokes. "But I shall never kill a 20-foot crocodile," said Darcy sadly. We went back to Yaluginda. Darcy stayed on there. Fifth and I went back to our eastern end of the Gulf, leaving Darcy contentedly alone in the world of snakes and rivers, trembling mirages and thirst, floods and cyclones, old man crocodiles, and sudden exploding death on the end of that rusty 303. He was returning to the Roper River to fill in the 2 months till the wet started. The season passed steadily for Fifth and me, bumpy tracks, smoky camps, black spotlit nights, and bags of skins consigned to cairns, and any day Harvey Wilson walked in he was due for a shock from the income tax people. We'd done what we set out to do, and now we'd reached the stage where each croc we shot was reminiscent of another. As the wet drew closer, we began to wonder where we'd go next and what we'd be doing. I first noticed it when Fifth said one day, "I wonder if we're going to be pioneers in a wild place where I'll have to do the cooking in a big open fireplace till you get the house finished. We might even have a baby." No comment. Most of the time. One of our favorite lying-in-bed games is remembering Darcy and the things that happened in the Gulf when we were professional croc shooters. Best professional croc shooters. Breshkovitz twitches dreaming at our feet and raises his head and thumps his tail whenever his name or Darcy's is mentioned. Remember him putting off getting away from the pub, Fifth will say. And cranking the blitz to save the battery, I will say. When he first went to the Gulf, he had to learn on his own. There was no one to teach him. With 2 Holden bonnets welded together for a boat, looking for important things lost on the back of the blitz. I wonder what Breshkovitz means. You're not supposed to have Alsatian dogs in the Northern Territory, in case they breed with the dingoes. Cooking the damper on a piece of green gum bark so we won't disturb the load getting the camp oven out of the wagon. But we always stop short before the end of the story. Breshkovitz arriving alone at the mission station, the search, the blitz, found forlorn among Darcy's usual scattered camp paraphernalia. The dinghy floating in the reeds 2 miles upstream, moored by the harpoon rope trailing overboard, the 22 on the floorboards, no sign of the 303, no sign of Darcy. He told me once, "You are not to be blaming the crocodile for every death on the river, but most of the time it is he." Perhaps he had found his 20-footer.